What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into the top 5 meta decks currently in standard best of 1 in MTG Arena. And the one thing I will be doing with today's video as we kind of get into the next season or the next set of MTG Arena is kind of go over the current decks that are currently at the top of the meta, especially if you're someone who's grinding the rankings and trying to figure out what other decks you are playing against, whether or not you're possibly playing one of the best decks in the format, or maybe if there's things you need to look out for when playing against these decks while ranking up in Arena. With that being said, if you like the button and hit that like button, it definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know when I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. With that being said, let's just dive into it. So here we are in Arena, and the first deck up on the list is going to be Orzhov Control. Now, this is a deck I feel like a lot of people have seen make its ways through the Arena in different variations. And I feel at one point it was like one of the more popular decks currently in the meta, but I think it's kind of slightly fallen down as other decks have developed to become slightly better of this. This is at number 5 on our list. It does consist of 25 common cards, 17 of them being lands, and 13 of them being basic lands, and 4 of them being the other snow tap basic land. 8 of them are going to be an uncommon. One of them is also a land, that being the Field of Ruin. We got 18 rares in the deck, and we have 9 mythics rounded out the deck. So overall, it kind of, spread out a little bit here, a little bit there. I know, like I said, the basic lands kind of make up a lot of the commons, but still, you see cards kind of spread out in the various rarities of the sort. The other thing to note here is if you wanted to buy these cards physically, the price range for putting this deck together for physical Magic is currently about $421, give or take, depending on where you look to buy your cards. And actually, surprisingly, a majority of that is, if you don't already know from if you're someone who plays physical Magic, that being Meathook Massacre. This card's actually, I think, roughly, depending on when you see this, is anywhere from like $65 all the way up to like $80, depending on where you go. So this card by itself, even just that 3 copies, literally almost takes up half of the deck build and budget if you were going to buy cards straight up and outright. It does have a current win rate of 55% against other decks in the meta, so definitely north of 50%, which is always good. That means you're winning more than you're losing. There are 38 cards in this deck that will actually rotate out in September, so if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of these cards and you're looking to possibly play a deck like this and you want to think about crafting wise and how long you'll be able to play these cards, 30 of them will rotate off standard in September. Just to give you a note, which is kind of a big hit, especially compared to the other decks that we'll be going over in today's video. So just to keep that as a note, you'll be kind of almost playing with a lot of these cards, like borrowing them essentially until they rotate out and then go into historic. So I mean, if you think of it in that regard, maybe they're not going to be wasted in that sense. Some of the notable cards I would say is Lolth Spider Queen. This is definitely a card that makes this deck definitely click, as it's one of those things that even when we chump block with our creatures, we will be able to put loyalty counters back on Lolth, therefore creating more spider tokens, which then we could use for chumping. We have Edgar, the Charmed Groom, another great card here that when out on the battlefield, it's the 4/4, and then when it dies, you get to return it back to the battlefield with its Edgar Markov Coffin, which produces vampire tokens, and it actually synergizes very well with our wedding announcement, which also produces 1/1 human creature tokens, though I don't think they're vampires. But anyway, I thought they would be vampires, but I guess I misunderstood when I first read the card. But definitely an interesting card to kind of combine there. And then, like I said, the other notable card would be Meathook Massacre. This is kind of like our big board wipe. This gets around a lot of your indestructible or ways that your opponent can prevent cards from dying that way, because -X definitely works differently than destroy if you're not aware of that. And that's why this card is just so good, because it is so versatile. And the other idea is too is even when we're chumping, we're also draining our opponent for 1 point of damage depending on how many creatures die on our side of the battlefield. So especially in the later game when maybe our opponent's not as at full life, they're slowly draining away their life totals a little bit by little bit. Now, to know another thing too about the deck before we kind of go into it a little bit more is that its best matchups are actually against Rakdos Sacrifice and mono white aggro, which is definitely good. And I would say there's other aggro decks too that this deck would be very good against, because Meathook Massacre is definitely one of those cards that will wipe out a board and then slowly drain your opponent over time and gain you life back. The other thing to note too is once you start getting into your like mid range of the game and get into your planeswalkers and things like that, sometimes getting over like a Lolth Spider Queen and also like a Storm the Merciless and even a Kaya to name those planeswalkers, it definitely makes it harder for your opponent to really get through for any more damage, because you just have a lot of defenses up and it just makes it harder for them to get up and over. Though I will say their worst matchups would be Is It Mill. It's just one of those decks that I feel like just floats around every now and then. You do get matched up against Is It Mill at 33% and Naya Runes at 38%. The one benefit I think that Naya Runes has against this deck is that it can hit you for a punch pretty quickly, and I don't think this deck has a lot of spot removal or instant spot removal that can really take care of that. And that's the one thing that I think hurts the deck. Even like with something like a Meathook Massacre or a Blood on the Snow, they're a little bit in the slower in terms of being able to wipe out a board And unfortunately, Vanish Inverse is only monocolor permanents, so if they put it on one of their multicolor permanents, you can't target it and exile it that way. And Rite of Oblivion is that sorcery speed, so if they can give the creature haste and get it really big really quickly, they can hit you in one shot before you can even do anything. But in that regard, it is still a very solid deck. Like I said, there's a lot more decks that it's above 50% that it's good against, besides those couple decks that are like below 40%, I guess, win rate. The deck, like I said, overall works in the regards of you have the Shambling Gas a little bit as a chump blocker, / a little bit of ramp, creating that treasure token. You have the Ambitious Farmhand, which helps us ramp up a little bit as it comes into the battlefield. We can search our library for a basic plains card, reveal and put into our hand, and that's shuffle. And we're not probably going to Coven at any point in this deck, but you know, you do have the ability at some point, maybe if you have it, you could always flip it to the 3/3 lifelinker side. Just Deadly Dispute will help us dig a little bit deeper by, like, say, sacrificing a Shambling Gas or a possible treasure token we're not currently using, allowing us to draw 2 cards and create a treasure token, which definitely helps us ramp as well. Rite of Oblivion is a very solid removal spell. This is definitely one of those cards you're going to still see a lot of, even in a post-rotation idea, because it gets for 2 mana, it exiles target non-land permanent by sacrificing a non-land permanent. So it's definitely good in that regard, and then you can flash it back for 4 mana and do it all over again. Vanish Inverse is also a very solid card against those monocolored decks, like the mono whites to mono greens, because it exiles straight up the opponent's creature, which removes it and doesn't go to the graveyard, so it definitely doesn't trigger any of those effects, but definitely a solid card regardless. Meathook Massacre is a great board wipe. It's definitely a reason why the card's so expensive, because it's very versatile in that regard as well, and it also drains your opponent whenever one of our creatures dies, and you gain life whenever one of their creatures dies. Wet Announcements, another one of those cards that turns all their smaller creatures in the later game into much bigger creatures, which makes them even more aggressive to block with and or attack with. And at the same time too, as we're kind of like slowly building up, every time until it gets those 3 counters, it is producing 1/1 human creature tokens, unless we have attacked with 2 or more creatures on a given turn, then we get to draw from it. But nonetheless, a very solid enchantment card that definitely makes the list here. Then you had Fellstinger. Yet again, we can, you know, sacrifice one of our little 1/1 tokens we have made, or itself, and we can exploit and then draw 2 cards and lose 2 life in the process. Or maybe you can drain your opponent for 2 life, even though you let them draw 2 cards in the process too, especially in the later game, maybe when they can't afford it as much. Then our Planeswalkers round out with Sorin the Merciless at 4 mana with a 4 loyalty. You can +1, look at the top card of your library, reveal a card and put it into your hand. If you do, use life equal to its mana value. So, like, lands will essentially cost you nothing to put into your hand, and then all the cards will cost whatever their mana costs into your hand. And if you have a lot of life, you maybe can sacrifice it and get maybe one of your spells you're really looking for, like a Meathook Massacre, and maybe wipe the board up. You can -2, create a 2/3 vampire token flyer, which definitely becomes in handy combined with Edgar Markov, as well as the Wet Announcement. It'll eventually become a 3/4 or a 4/5, depending on the situation. And if we ever get Sorin to a -7, we can always -7, deal 13 damage to any target, and gain 13 life. Edgar Charmed Groom is a 4 mana 4/4, which is just in himself is a pretty decent card. What you could do is, if you have multiples of these in your hand, you could play one on one turn, and then the following turn maybe attack in with it. If they don't chump block it or kill it, you can then play the other one in your hand and actually kill it by legend rule, but then it's going to flip over to the coffin, and then you can essentially have both of these out on the battlefield at the same time simultaneously, which is definitely a cool little awesome like mechanic that the deck definitely has. And then its flip side will, at the beginning of our upkeep, we can create a 1/1 white and black vampire creature token with lifelink and put a blowline counter on the coffin, and if there are 3 or more blowline counters on it, you get to remove those counters and transform it back to the Markov or the Edgar. So definitely a good card in that sense. As long as it's not exiled, they'll stay out in the battlefield for the rest of the game in that regard. Then you have Volt the Spider Queen. In itself is a great planeswalker, 5 mana for loyalty. Whenever a creature we control dies, you get to put a loyalty counter on Volt Spider Queen. For 0, we can draw a card, we lose a life, so actually not a bad trade-off in that regard. -3, we can create 2/1 Spider Black creature tokens with Menace and Reach. Definitely good at chumping blockers, also getting in for some aggressive attacks. And then -8, we get an emblem whenever an opponent is dealt combat damage by 1 or more creatures who control. If that player lost less than 8 life this turn, they lose life equal to the difference. So essentially just rounding them up to 8 life lost for the turn. So definitely good there. And then we have Kaya and Inexorable, the 5 mana, 5 loyalty planeswalker. That one, you can put a ghost counter onto target non-token creature. It gains when this creature dies, or is put into exile, return to its owner's hand and create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So definitely interested in that regard. You can always get back Fellstinger or any of our other creatures in the deck in that sense. You can -3, you can exile target non-land permanent, essentially targeting anything your opponent may have on the battlefield other than lands. And then -7, you get an emblem at the beginning of your upkeep. You can cast a legendary spell from your hand or from your graveyard or among cards you own an exile while paying its mana cost. So definitely an interesting minus ability that I don't think I've seen many people pull off, but definitely cool if you ever get to that point. And then for 6 mana, we have the 2 Blood on the Snows, just an additional board wipe. But because we are playing snow permanents, we do have the possibility that whenever we either destroy all creatures or destroy all planeswalkers, we possibly could return a creature or planeswalker card with mana value X or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, where X is the amount of snow mana to cast a spell. So the idea here is that you can always wipe the board, get back something like a Lolth, a Kaya, or even a Sorin, or any of our other creatures depending on the situation. Get them onto the battlefield, so essentially you wipe the board of all the creatures, you get back a planeswalker and or a creature, and then you're kind of one up on your opponent in that sense. And then the mana base is 5 of the snow-covered plains, 1 of the Hive Tyrant, which is definitely good in the sense that this is a little bit of more of a control deck, a little bit slower. You create your 3/3 land creature out of this with Menace, and then whenever it attacks, you can exile a card possibly from the graveyard that you may not want them to get back or any sense or flashback. Then we got 8 of the snow-covered swamps, 4 of the pathways, 2 of the shattered sanctums. We have 4 copies of the snowfield sinkhole, and then 1 copy field of ruin just in case your opponent's playing creature lands. But like I said, it's one of those decks that is very solid option even in today's meta. It does, like I said, have its weak points, but it is one of those decks that when it is going and, maybe there is not as many Naya Rune players, this deck definitely can hold its own in the current meta. So the next deck up on the list is actually Esper Control. Yet again, another control deck. You'll notice that in more of a best of 1 format, the control decks are a little bit lower than the aggro decks. And I think in more of a best of 3 matchup, it actually flips just because of sideboarding. But you now have Esper Control, yet again, another control style deck. This one focuses a little bit more on field disruption, spell disruption, and things like that. We're trying to keep the board pretty much clean, kind of get into our late game, get to our Hullbreaker Horrors, or get our Planeswalkers going in that sense. But this deck, for the most part, consists of 6 common cards, 3 of them are basic lands, 7 uncommons, 41 rare cards, 6 mythics. So a little bit, yet again, on the expensive side, a lot of rare cards, a lot of mythics, making up about 47 of the cards that are actually in the deck. And then we have, if you want to buy this deck outright, you're actually looking at probably spending about $454, give or take. So even more expensive than the deck before. And this one doesn't even have Meathook Massacre, so a lot of the value is like spread out throughout a few cards. Notable being probably the Planeswalkers are probably where some of the expense comes from. Surprisingly, some of the pathways I think are also up there in price. At like $8 or $9 a piece. As Paper Magic comes back and demand goes up, the prices will go up in that regard. But to kind of get on the idea that if you want to build the deck, you are going to get 25 cards that will be rotating out in September. A lot of the decks that have pathways as a lot of the mana base, those are where a lot of the cards go. This one doesn't have as many. I think it has like 7 of them. It does have a Hall of the Storm Giants, but still you're looking at about 8 of the lands getting rotated out come September. And then some of the cards that are within the deck, some of the disruption and things like that. But overall, a very interesting, very strong control deck that is pretty good. There are some good matchups that this deck has, especially against like things like Selesnya Enchantments at 60% win rate. Orzhov Control, it's about 55%, so it wins more than half of the games against that. Yet again, I guess control decks and mill decks just don't go together. Is It Mill's actually one of the worst decks that it performs against at 30%, and that's just because, I guess these decks can't attack fast enough before Is It Mill really goes off. And then Mono Red Aggro is one of those ones where this deck struggles against. Yet again, another quick deck that can hit you fast and hard before you really build up any sort of board presence or way to slow them down. So yet again, another deck that this deck is a little bit weak against. But as to say, this deck is very solid, has a lot of versatile tools. You have 2 March of the Lights, where you can exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment card, mana value X or less. And then as additional cost is cast a spell, you may exile any number of white cards from your hand. The spell costs 2 less to cast for each card exiled this way. So definitely a good, getting rid of maybe a pesky creature, enchantment, or something your opponent may have, or artifact in that sense. Then you also have March of the Wretched Sorrow. It's a X black card that has additional cost to cast a spell. You may exile any black cards from your hand to make the spell cost 2 less for exile to cast this way. And it deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life. So just deal X, gain X, and then you can target creatures or planeswalkers, so as some more spot removal. Then you have the Sunset Revelry, which kind of helps us kind of sustain the board or in the early game, especially if your opponent's trying to get wide really, really quick. If we've lost any life, we can, if our opponent has more life than us, and we gain 4 life. If our opponent has more creatures than us, we get to 1/1 human creature tokens. And if our opponent has more cards in hand, we get to draw a card. So definitely a very versatile card depending on the game situation. It is one of those things that kind of helps stall the early game, kind of helping us get into our mid to late game is where the deck is going to definitely thrive. Jwari Disruption, yet again, against those decks that are going to tap all out in the early game. For 2 mana, you can counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. In the late game, if we draw, and we definitely think our opponent can pay the mana to not counter the spell, we can always play it as the tap land on the other side. And then you have Negate. Yet again, one of those cards that would be good against decks that play a lot of spells. But if they don't play a lot of non-creature spells, it is going to be one of those dead cards in your hand, unfortunately, and you'll just be sitting on it, just like Test of Talents. Same thing like Negate. It counters target instant or sorcery spell. Then you get to search its controller's graveyard, hand, library for any number of cards with the same name as that spell, exile them, and that player draws a card for each card exiled from their hand this way. But yet again, another dead card in decks where they don't play a lot of instants and sorceries. Vanish Inverse, yet again, a very solid removal spell against those monocolored decks. Even in the multicolored decks, there's a lot of monocolored creatures there, and an exile and target monocolored permanent in general is definitely very solid. Also gets rid of pesky planeswalkers like the wolves and things like that. Then we Kaido Suzuki. It's a 3-mana 3 loyalty planeswalker. At the beginning of our end step, if Kaido entered the battlefield this turn, he faces out. So the first time you play it, he's going to phase out, and then for +1 we can draw a card and then discard a card unless we attack this turn. We can -2, we create a 1/1 ninja creature token that this creature can't be blocked, and then -7 we get an emblem. Whenever a creature we control deals damage to a player, search your library for a blue or black creature card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. For the most part, it's really just going to be balancing probably the +1 and -2, as we're just really more so trying to get in for either some points of damage as well as, get that card advantage, and that +1 is going to get us definitely there. The Wandering Emperor is a card that makes the list. It's a 4-mana 3 loyalty planeswalker with flash, and as long as Wandering Emperor is entered the battlefield this turn, we can activate the loyalty of abilities at any time. You can cast an instant. So for +1, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. It gains first strike until end of turn. -1, we create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance, and for -2, we can exile target tap creature. You gain 2 life. So the best way for this deck to really utilize this card is kind of wait until your opponent attacks, taps their creatures down. You play a Wandering Emperor, and then you exile maybe their biggest creature, and you gain 2 life in the process. So maybe negating a little bit of an attack there. But overall, very strong planeswalker that works very well with these control decks. Then we have Behold the Multiverse as a 4-mana draw, scry 2, then draw 2, and we can also foretell it, and then playing it later for only 2 mana at a 1 and a blue. So definitely a very solid kind of like late, mid to late game draw spell. You set it up maybe early, and then as you kind of get a little bit thin on cards in your hand, you can foretell it and play it at instant speed. Same thing with Memory Deluge. It's a very solid card. You look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast a spell. You put 2 of them into your hand, the rest in the bottom of your library in any random order. So if we're looking for answers, depending on the game state situation. And then for 7 mana, we can flash it back, playing it again at instant speed. And then we do the same thing, but we do it for 7 cards this time, hopefully looking for an answer that we really need to maybe help us, either stabilize the playing field or possibly keep in the game, especially if we get low on life. But definitely a very solid card nonetheless. Doomskar is another card here. It's our board wipe of choice in this deck. It destroys all creatures, and we can foretell it for 2 mana and play for 3 mana when we think that the best situation for it is to play it. Just a board wipe, regardless, destroy all creatures. Pretty solid. Definitely going to help us against those aggro matchups. And then in the 5+ drop slot, you have the first card being up is for Farewell. It's a 6 mana. You get to choose 1 or more. You get to exile all artifacts, exile all creatures, exile all enchantments, and exile all graveyards. So yet again, depending on the game you are playing, you can choose things that maybe benefit you and then hurt your opponent. But overall, a great versatile board wipe that kind of hits a bunch of various different things, especially with Naya Ruins being a thing, exile all enchantments and exile on all creatures and possibly exile on all graveyards. Kind of hits them hard in 3 different places. And then exile on our artifacts is kind of one of those things. We don't really play artifacts in our deck, but maybe we get matched up against a deck that plays artifacts. Definitely a good option to have there as well. We've got Amiria's Shattered Sky Cave or Amiria's Call, a 7 mana sorcery spell that you create 2 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying. Non-digital creatures we control gain indestructible in a turn, and then we can pay it as a land on the other side by paying 3 life and have it become battlefield not tap. But very solid card. Yet again, one of those things that, if we get to the 7 mana, we think we can finish off our opponent. We can always play this side. We can always play as a land in the early game if we don't think we're going to get there, or we want to make sure we get there. Definitely a solid card there. And then we have Hullbreaker Horror. It's a 7 mana 7/8 with flash, and it can't be countered. And then whenever we cast a spell, we get to choose up to 1. And we get to return target spell we don't control to its owner's hand, or return target online permanent to its owner's hands. So depending on the situation, we can either bounce itself back if our opponent's trying to remove it from the battlefield, or we can bounce the spell back that they're casting to maybe they're trying to play a creature or something like that by casting one of our cheaper spells and just triggering the ability of this particular card. And then, like I said, in control decks, the mana base is probably key, so you want to make sure you have like your 27 lands or so, I would say, if I'm not mistaken. It's 23, and then I think, you got the 4 copies of... You got the 4 two copies of the Emeria's Call. You have the 3 copies of Jawari Disruption. So you're looking at probably 28 lands in this deck, but overall very solid control deck that's definitely going to disrupt your opponent and kind of slow down the game to hopefully get you to that late game. The next deck up on the list is a deck that I feel like everyone probably is annoyed of at this point, but it is a very solid deck regardless, and that is Naya Runes. Coming in at 5 commons, all of them being basic lands, 24 uncommons, 28 rares, and 3 mythics. Definitely a very balanced, very balanced when it comes to uncommons to rares in that sense. It is only $241 if you want to buy the cards outright physically. And I actually think, like I said with the other decks, a lot of the money comes from the lands for the most part, as I think the creatures are actually not on the expensive side. One being Runeforge Champion, as really the only deck that it really fits in is this particular deck. So usually those situational cards usually aren't as bad price-wise. And then the other couple cards in the deck probably outside of the lands aren't super expensive. Actually, I think the Kamigawa lands are also really expensive. So I think these are like 20 to 30 bucks depending on which ones they are. So that's probably where a lot of the money comes from as well. But regardless, it is a very solid deck. It is about a win rate of about 56%, of about 180,000 games played, which is definitely makes it viable that the deck is pretty good, especially in best of 1. Though there are 32 cards going to be rotating out of this deck come September, one of them being kind of like what makes the deck Naya Runes, and that is the Runeforge Champion and all the runes. So in that sense, if you're looking to probably play an enchantment deck and don't want to play Naya Runes, you can always look at the Selesnya Enchantments deck, which I think mostly plays all the newer enchantments that have recently come out. So I think there's a couple of them that are a little bit on the older side, but it's not as, it doesn't hurt as much, especially come September when rotation happens and you lose a lot of cards. I think other than the runes and the Runeforge Champion, it's also all of the pathways will also be rotating out as well as the Showdown of the Scalds. And I think that's about it, but like I said, that's a good majority of the deck. But to also throw it out there, a couple of its best matchups would be Rakdos Sacrifice at 68%, so definitely good against the Rakdos Sacrifice, and also Mono Black Control, as I guess us being able to kind of replay our runes, have a decent amount of aggressiveness, definitely gets us maybe through, especially, getting like Rune of Might on stuff, definitely makes a lot of those like Wolf Spider, Queen Spiders actually not be able to chump as well, which is definitely one of those things that definitely helps us in those matchups where opponent's going to try to chump as best as possible. Its worst matchups though would be against Mono White Aggro, about 37%, and I would say a chunk of that also becomes from the idea that there's right now, if you probably looked out there at Mono White, there is a Death and Taxes version where it actually, restricts on how much you can search your library for things, and that actually hurts this deck because Runeforge Champion allows us to search our library, and I think there's a card in the deck, I forget what the card is off the top of my head, but it only lets you like search the top 4 cards of your library, so definitely a card that hurts in that sense. And also I think the Death and Taxes deck also limits on how much tempo we can get on a single turn, so limit us to like 1 spell a turn is definitely also very hurtful. The other deck that is actually that this deck's not as good against is also Naya Humans, and I actually think we'll get into that eventually. But that deck does have a lot of answers to our decks, because our cards in this deck, because that deck has a lot of cards that can target one card, and that actually is kind of how this deck works, is that we kind of pump up a card, get it very big, and kind of get in through for that damage. But regardless, I would still say it's a very solid deck, a very easy deck to pick up and play. The cards, a lot of the cards, you don't have to, you can read them, kind of really understand what the deck does. But for the most part, it is a very simple deck. The first card in the deck is the 1-mana 1/1 Spirit, that whenever we cast an enchantment spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, either itself or any of our other creatures that we may play in the future, or in that regard. So definitely a solid card there. Then you have Machiko's Reign of Truth. I'm butchering all these card names. It's a saga that for the first 2 turns, it gives target creature +1/+1 till end of turn for each artifact and or enchantment. So definitely a good way to get our creatures big really, really quickly. And then on the third saga, you get to the third chapter of the saga, you flip it over, it becomes a 0/0 creature that gets +1/+1 for each other artifact and or enchantment we control. So in and by itself, it is a 1/1 if you only have this on the battlefield. So still a card that gets bigger as the game goes on and you play more and more enchantments, so definitely good in that sense. Yeah, the Rune of Sustenance, just a 2-mana rune that when it enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card. And we can target lands with this because it is an enchant permanent, it's not an enchant creature. As long as Enchanted Permanent is a creature, it has lifelink. As long as Enchanted Permanent is equipped, it has equipped creature has lifelink. Definitely solid there. The other cool thing that you can do with this is you can actually target, our creature lands, which I just realized this deck doesn't play any. But if you had creature lands, like if you had like the green creature land where you have tap X and green, you can actually target, your creature lands with runes, which is definitely pretty cool. Next rune up is Rune of Speed. It's a 2-mana rune that enchant permanent, and when a rune enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card. As long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +1/+0 and also has haste. And as long as enchanted permanent is equipment, it has equipped creature gets +1/+0 and haste. But we're not really using it for the equipment part. We're using it more so for the haste part. And then we have Kami, Transcendence. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with trample that whenever we cast an enchantment spell, we get to put +1/+1 counter on Kami. At the beginning of our end step, if an enchantment was put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn, you may return Kami or the Transcends from our graveyard to our hand. So definitely like a good way that Kami just keeps on coming back even if they spot removal it. So definitely a good card to put our runes on. If our opponent has to spot removal it, we'll get it back in that sense. Next card up is Rune of Might. This is the rune that will give us trample whenever we target a creature with it and or land. And then when it enters the battlefield, we have to draw a card, and it gives target creature +1/+1, and trample is definitely good in that sense. Then you have Jukai, the Naturalist, a 2-mana 2/2 lifelinker. That enchantment spells cost us 1 less to cast, so making all our runes by itself 1 mana less cheaper. So definitely taking these 2-mana runes and making it only the color that it needs in order to cast that rune. The other cool thing is the next card is Runeforge Champion. It's a 3-mana 2/3 Dwarf Warrior that enters the battlefield. We get to search our library and our graveyard for a rune card and reveal it. We get to put it into our hand. If we search our library this way, we get to shuffle, and then you may pay 1 rather than pay the mana for the rune spell that we want to cast. So the one cool thing is that himself, he makes the rune cost now 1 colorless, and then combine it with Junkai Naturalist, it actually makes it now cause 0, so it makes all the runes essentially free if we have these two out. So definitely a good combo piece there to make us, be very tempo heavy, and we can cast multiple runes on the same turn without actually having to tap a single mana. Combine that with things like Hallowed Haunting. It's a 4-mana enchantment. As long as we control 7 or more enchantments, creatures we control have flying and vigilance, so that means they don't tap to attack. And then when we cast an enchantment spell, create a white spirit creature token with this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of spirits we control. And we get a bunch of them out pretty quickly, especially when we get our free runes out and we can cast multiple spells on the same given turn. Then we have Shodan of the Scalds. It's a 4-mana enchantment saga that at the first chapter, we have to exile top 4 cards of our library until end of our next turn, and then we play those cards. So it lets us get a little bit deeper, kind of lets us get our tempo, keep our tempo going. And then on the chapters 2 and 3, that whenever we cast a spell this turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature control. So definitely making it that much stronger in that regard. But overall, very solid card that helps us keep our tempo up. And then in the mana base, yet again, we have the list of various lands that we need to make the Naya deck work. We have lands that produce green. We have lands that produce white and red, and we have the pathways that help us fix our mana in that regard. We also have a copy of Boseu here, which destroys target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land an opponent controls. That player may search the library for a land card with basic land type, put on the battlefield, and start shuffle, which is kind of like interesting. We could target like creature lands if that's what is annoying us in that regard. And then we also the Ganjo, Seed of the Empire. We can, for 3 mana, deal 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. So you get another spot removal spell in the deck. But what we're trying to do is get big creatures against our opponents, so we're just attacking them over and over again with big creatures, and we don't really play a lot of removal. So that's kind of like our goal, is to get bigger than our opponent's creatures and just attacking them very aggressively. So definitely a very solid deck, very easy deck to pick up, but overall very good deck. So the next deck up on the list is a deck that I feel like a lot of people are probably annoyed with at this time, and that is Mono White Aggro. It is a deck that's kind of been pretty prominent in standard meta pretty much since, I guess, about a year ago from now, I think, is when it kind of made its prominence to kind of like being one of the top decks currently in the format. And this version of the deck comes in at 19 commons, all basic lands. Because it is a monocolored deck, we can play 19 basic lands and it'll be perfectly fine mana-wise. There are 6 uncommons, 28 rares, and 7 mythics. Though I will say, it is the cheapest deck out of all of them. If you want to buy it physically in paper, it is coming in at $107, so pretty cheap deck. It does have a win rate of about 58% out of 380,000 played matches. So if it doesn't give you any indication of how good the deck is, so 58%, 380,000 matches, I think we kind of understand how good the deck is. There are 16 cards that will be rotating out in September, most of them being, a couple of the creatures, but I think there are still a decent amount of pieces still left in the deck if I actually were to pull those cards out just by quickly clicking, and they're not really that bad. I think they're easily replaceable. I mean, some of them aren't like super replaceable, but some of them are. Like we have our creature lands. Maybe we'll get some new creature lands in the near future. Portable Hole is a little bit of a spot removal spell, but it's definitely something the deck doesn't need if it goes away. You have Usher the Fallen. Maybe there's another 1-drop that we can find to maybe replace it. Luminarch Aspirant. We don't have a way to get +1/+1 counters on something, but definitely a card that is definitely replaceable because it is one of those things that, it does help the deck, but it's not necessary for the deck. And you have Elite Spellbinder. It's a 3-mana 3/1 that we get to tax in a card in our opponent's hand, making it 2 more to cast. So definitely a card that's definitely not necessary, but regardless, if you kind of pull those cards out, the deck still looks pretty solid, and I do think there's a lot of options to go from there. Other than that, its best matchups would be Izzet Mill. As this deck can, ramp up pretty quickly, even by turn 3 at 71%, it wins those matches. And then also Naya Runes hits very good against that because we have things like Thalia, which taxes our opponent's, runes, making their non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast, which kind of counteracts them making their runes cost cheaper. We also have Brutal Cathar, which we can target a creature an opponent controls, and it's pretty much exiled until Brutal Cathar leaves the battlefield, so definitely good there. Wandering Emperor is another great card to combat Lake Runes because your opponent's going to tap their creature to attack with unless somehow they get to their 7 enchantment on the battlefield. But you can exile target tap creature, you gain 2 life. You have Aganjo, Seed of the Empire, you get again spot removal there. You have Faithful Absence, more spot removal. You have your Hopeful Initiate for 3 mana. You can remove 2 counters from among creatures we control, and we can destroy target artifact and/or enchantment. So a lot of ways to deal with what they're trying to do on their side of the battlefield, and that's not including things like also Portable Hole, taxing cards in their hand with Elite Spellbinder. So definitely this deck has a lot of versatility. That's why the deck is so good, not just against runes, but just against all decks in general. And some of its worst matchups actually are against Mono Black and Orzhov Control. And I think the reason why is both of those decks play Meathook Massacre. And while, other than that, the Meathook Massacre is kind of like the one card that takes out pretty much anything in this deck because you really can't get creatures bigger than the Meathook Massacre unless you have a couple Luminarch Aspirants out and you're really cranking in those +1/+1 counters on something. One Meathook Massacre is kind of like what you need to kind of like wipe the board and kind of take advantage of it in that regard. So definitely the weakest matchups is probably any deck that plays Meathook Massacre for that most point, other than those two. But those are 42 and 44% that it wins against them, which isn't terrible, but it's not great. It's below 50%, which is not great. But still, it is a very, 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 very solid matchup regardless. And let me just kind of put these cards back in their place so I can kind of go over each one of them in a little bit more detail if you would like that. So like I said, the first card up is Hopeful Initiate. It's a 1-mana 1/2 with Training, and Training means that whenever this creature attacks with another creature with greater power, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So a creature that does become bigger, and you can combine it with putting Hopeful Initiate with a creature that attacks alongside Luminarch Aspirant, and then they both kind of grow in that regard. Portable Hole for a little bit of that early game spot removal spell that you get to exile target not only a permanent opponent controls with mana value 2 or less, can target runes, can target creatures, can target your opponent's enchantments and things like that. Usher the Fallen, a very solid 1-drop at a 2/1 with the boast of 2, where you can create a 1/1 white human creature token and you can boast whenever you attack. And then Faithful Aspirants, that's some spot removal, though your opponent does get a clue token that they can sacrifice for 2 mana and draw a card. Intrepid Adversary is kind of like a Glorious Anthem built into a card, as this card in itself is a 3/1 lifelinker, but when it enters the battlefield, we can pay 2 mana any number of times, and when we do, we get to put that many Valor counters on Intrepid Adversary. And then creatures we control get +1/+1 for each Valor token on Intrepid Adversary. For 4 mana, you can at least pump all your creatures by +1/+1, if not more, depending on the state of the game and how much mana you have currently out. Luminarch Aspirant is going to pump any creature that we want to with a +1/+1 counter, even itself, which is definitely very, very good. And combine that with, say, something like Hopeful Initiate, and you want to remove an artifact or enchantment from the battlefield, you can always have that 3 mana open and kind of target that. Thalia is there to tax our opponent's non-creature spells, which is definitely very, very good. And we don't play a lot ourselves, so it's not really going to hit anything that we own other than our Wandering Emperor. So that is the one downfall. But for the most part, we're pretty okay with that in that regard. They have Brutal Cathar, a 3-mana 2/2 that we get to exile target creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, and it starts the Daybound Nightbound cycle. And on the Nightbound side, it becomes a 3/3 with first strike. And then if our opponent wants to target it with a spell, they have to pay 3 life. So depending on the state of the time of the game and whether or not your opponent has some sort of spot removal for it, they may not. They more than likely don't want to pay that 3 life to really target it. And if it flips again back to its Brutal Cathar, we get to do that the Brutal Cathar side all over again, so we can take something else and put it underneath Brutal Cathar. Elite Spellbinder is a 3-mana 3/1 flyer that enters the battlefield. You look at an opponent's hand, you may exile a non-land card from it. For as long as the card remains in exiled, its owner may play it, though the spell is going to cost 2 more to cast. So definitely a great card that's going to tax your opponents. Maybe play this if you're on the play, you play this, you disrupt what they're going to do on turn 3, because now you're making their turn 3 spell now costs 5 mana, and that kind of ruins their whole like momentum or tempo of what they were doing on their side of the battlefield. So overall, very solid card in that sense. They have Adeline Resplendent Cathar. It's a 3-mana star 4. It has Vigilance, and when it enters, its power is equal to the number of creatures it controls. So even playing it itself, it's still a 1/4 with Vigilance. And then whenever we attack for each opponent, we could create a 1/1 right human creature token that is tapped and attacking that player or planeswalker they control. So immediately you attack in with it. Even by itself, it's a 1/4. You get the 1/1 human creature token. It becomes a 2/4, so definitely good in that sense. And it's definitely one of those things that once we kind of get our board state going and get the board decently wide, it's one of those cards that becomes very problematic very, very quickly against our opponent. And then the last card to round out for when it comes to things that aren't lands in the deck, it's the Wandering Emperor. It's a 4-mana 3 loyalty planeswalker with flash. You can flash it in and play its abilities as if we were casting an instant, so we can give target creature +1/+1 first strike. We can make a 2/2 white samurai creature token with Vigilance, or we can exile target tap creature an opponent controls, then we gain 3 life. And then the mana base has 2 copies of the Cave of the Frost Dragon, 2 copies of Aganjo, Seed of the Empire, and 19 basic lands. So yet again, if you haven't seen Mono White, this is Mono White in a nutshell. It's nothing super crazy. It is very, very straightforward. It is just trying to smash your opponent's face in as quickly as possible, while also just playing a bunch of cheap spells that are very, very effective against most things. And let's move on to the next deck. The next deck up on the list is going to be Naya Humans. And I think this is one of those decks that gets overshadowed by Mono White because it plays a lot of the same spells that Mono White does, but it splashes in some other colors to do some other things. But this deck comes in at 2 base, 2 commons, 2 uncommons, 44 rares, and 8 mythics. And with a total price total of $227 if you were to craft this version. The win rate is about 59%, so just slight above Mono White. Though I will say it only has about half as many matches at being 170,000 matches played. So it is one of those things that is up to debate. You know, if Naya Humans got anywhere close to Mono White's games played. So it is something that maybe will actually go a little bit lower based on that. It also has 24 cards rotating out in September, 16 of them being lands, so hopefully we maybe get some replacements. So it's actually not that bad. So you're literally looking at about 8 cards they have to replace. And I can already see what they are in the main deck, and that is Luminarch Aspirant and Elite Spellbinder. You could probably find some other things. Is this one of those cases where you bring in that 2-mana human that gives all other humans you control tap the ability to create a mana that I think is the colors of mana that they can produce. Oh, also there's Minsk as well. Sorry, I forgot Minsk. So maybe there's only 15 lands that actually rotate out. I don't know. But regardless, it is one of those things that there are a couple things that rotate out, but I don't think it's as big of a deal. It could be makes the deck slot, makes Mono White last a little bit longer by switching over to Naya Humans. Other than that, the best matchups it does have is against Is It Mill and Naya Runes. Yet again, I do think it's just because this deck plays a lot of the same cards that are to the advantage that like Mono White have. Has the Brutal Cathars. It has things that attacks your opponent's hand like Elite Spellbinder. It also has the Thalias. It also has, things like Valorous Stance, which is definitely very good, especially when your opponent starts pumping up one of their creatures. Its toughness becomes so great that you can just always target with a Valorous Stance. Other than that, it's definitely one of those things that can be more aggressive much quicker because Helena and Elena Partners is another great card that actually is one of those things I feel like people are realizing how good it is because at the beginning of your combat, you put X +1/+1 counters on another creature you control where X is Elena's power, and that creature gains haste on a turn. So it's kind of like a way to get a creature in for some big damage. Put on something like an Adeline, your Adeline becomes bigger, which is definitely very good. Definitely pretty awesome. Its worst matchups, though, I would say is Mono White at 49%. So is it really a bad matchup? Because it's just slightly below 50%. And also Mono Black, which yet again, I guess is just because Mono Black has, Meathook Massacre and things like that. Though I would say this deck tries its best to combat it, has things that can hopefully pump up. But yet again, I think Meathook Massacre is the reason why that is why it is. But for the most part, you look through the deck, I can kind of go through it all over again, but you have the Hopeful Initiate with the Train in, the 1/2 for 1 mana, tap 3, remove 2 +1/+1 counters from among creatures you control, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Intrepid Adversary, yet again, 2 mana, 3/1 with lifelink. It enters the battlefield to pay 2 mana anytime as many times as we can, and we put that many Valor counters on it, and creatures we control get +1/+1 for each Valor counter on it. Lumark Aspirant is just distributes a +1/+1 counter to target creature we control. Thalia is going to tax our opponent's non-creature spells as well as our own. Valorous Stance is kind of one of our ways to give maybe a creature we control indestructible and or destroy target creature and opponent controls with 4 toughness or greater. Brutal Cathara is a spot removal spell. Exile a creature our opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, and as long as if it kind of triggers the daybound nightbound cycle, which is definitely good in that sense. Elise Spellbinder, we're going to look at our opponent's hand. We're going to tax something in their hand and making it 2 more to cast. Adeline, it's a 3 mana star 4 based on how many creatures we have on the battlefield. Its power is equal to that many creatures. Then whenever we attack, regardless if Adeline's attacking, we're still going to get 1/1 white human creature token into the battlefield tapped and attacking, and then it can attack a planeswalker and or a creature they control. We have Minsk as a 1-off because it enters the battlefield, create a Boo, the legendary 1/1 red hamster creature token with trample and haste. And then tap X until end of turn creature control gains base power and toughness XX and becomes a giant in addition to its other types, and activate only as a sorcery. So this a cool way to kind of sink some mana into something, maybe make something that's kind of small a little bit bigger. I'll combine that with say something with a Hopeful Initiate, maybe being able to pump up a Hopeful Initiate with some +1/+1 counters. Helena and Elena Partners is a 4 mana 2/3, pumping up one of our other creatures by giving them +2 +1/+1 counters and giving a haste as well until end of turn. And then Sigarda is a 4 mana 4/4 flyer trample that gives other humans we control +1/+1. And then Coven, whenever it attacks, if we control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you get to look top 5 cards of our library, reveal a human creature among them, put it into our hand and the rest of the bottom of our library. So it kind of helps us dig a little bit, keep the tempo going. But overall, very solid deck. And then in the non-basic, or in the land base, we have 4 of the Cave of the Frost Giants. We have, a plethora of various pathways and a couple of the dual lands with the Showdown of the Pass and the Rockfall Vale and the Overgrown Farmland. But overall, this is a very solid deck that, I think, yet again, is very underrated just because Mono White is kind of a deck that overshadows this deck, but it is definitely as competitive as that particular deck. But with that being said, is there any deck that I may not gone over that you think is definitely pretty good against the meta as a whole? Let me know in the comments below. I will also have all these deck lists posted down below, as well as a couple of variants in case, let's say, for example, you don't want to play Naya Ruins, you want to maybe check out a Selesnya Enchantments. I'll leave that one down in the comments below. I'll also leave the Mono White Death and Taxes if you want to take that a look. If you're just annoyed with any deck that kind of searches their library for things, that is another deck to maybe take a look at. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you don't want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next video.